Emily sat by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The soft hum of the dishwasher echoed through the otherwise silent house. Evening had settled, but Daniel hadn't called. Again. She reached for her half-empty cup of tea, now lukewarm. The bitter taste didn't bother her. It mirrored her mood. For the fifth night in a row, her husband's absence filled the rooms more than his presence ever did. They had been married for 5 years. Once, that meant something. Shared glances across crowded rooms, spontaneous road trips, midnight whispers under warm blankets. But somewhere between promotions and endless business meetings, Daniel had slipped away, leaving behind only the shell of a marriage. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. But perhaps that made it worse. His neglect was wrapped in politeness, his distance masked by responsibility. He provided everything but himself. The front door opened. Emily straightened. "Hey," Daniel said, without looking up from his phone. His tie was loose, his eyes glazed from fatigue or disinterest. "You're late again," she said softly. "Board meeting ran over. You know how it is." He kissed her cheek in passing, already loosening his cufflinks. She followed him into the kitchen. "I made pasta. Your favorite." "That's sweet. But I grabbed something on the way." He opened the fridge, reached for a bottle of water, and walked toward his office. Emily stood there, invisible in her own home. Later that evening, she curled up on the couch, scrolling through photos from their early days. Her smile in those pictures felt foreign now, forced, as if belonging to another woman entirely. A knock at the door pulled her back to the present. It was Ryan. "Daniel here?" he asked, stepping in without waiting for an answer. "No, he's in his office. Probably buried in spreadsheets." Ryan chuckled. "Some things never change." He handed her a small brown bag. "Brought you that cinnamon cake you like. The one from Gable's Cafe." She smiled, genuinely this time. "You remembered?" "Of course I did." He shrugged. "Someone has to." Emily motioned him toward the living room. The scent of cinnamon filled the air as she unwrapped the cake. It was warm, fresh, thoughtful, unlike anything Daniel had done in months. "Rough day?" Ryan asked, watching her closely. "Just one of those days," she said, hesitating. "You don't have to pretend with me, Em." She looked at him, really looked. Ryan had always been the charming one, the funny one. But tonight, there was something deeper in his eyes. A softness that unnerved her. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just furniture in this house," she admitted. "Always present. Never noticed." Ryan didn't speak right away. He reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. His touch was warm, grounding. Too long, they lingered like that. Hands joined in unspoken understanding. "I see you," he said, his voice low. Emily swallowed hard. The moment stretched between them like a thread, delicate but dangerous. She pulled her hand away. "I should check on Daniel." Ryan stood too, nodding. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, he glanced back, his expression unreadable. "You deserve more, Emily. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After he left, she sat in the quiet, her heart beating faster than it should have. His words echoed in her mind. "You deserve more." That night, Daniel climbed into bed beside her without a word. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't notice the untouched dinner, the half-wilted roses she had placed in a vase. He turned off the light and turned away, lost in his own world. Emily lay still, staring at the ceiling, Ryan's voice lingering like a whisper against her skin. "I see you." For the first time in months, someone had. It started subtly, like a whisper slipping beneath a closed door. Emily found herself anticipating Ryan's visits. Not in the way one looks forward to company, but in the way a dry field longs for rain. He didn't come often, yet his presence lingered long after he left. Daniel, as usual, was buried in work. Most evenings, his dinner sat untouched until she cleared it away silently. If he noticed, he said nothing. If he cared, he didn't show it. One Friday afternoon, Ryan called unexpectedly. "I'm picking up wine for the weekend. Want some company?" Emily hesitated. "Daniel might be home tonight." "Might," he echoed with a faint laugh. But is he ever really there? She didn't answer. A few hours later, Ryan arrived with a bottle of red and a lightness in his demeanor that filled the air like music. They sat on the patio, the sun melting into the horizon. The wine loosened her, and soon, so did her tongue. "I used to think love was enough," she said, swirling the liquid in her glass. "That if two people really cared, everything else would fall into place." Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching her. "And now I think love isn't loud enough to be heard over silence." He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he asked, "When was the last time he made you feel seen?" Emily smiled bitterly. "You already know the answer." The conversation shifted to lighter things: travel, music, old memories. But the undercurrent of emotion remained, flowing just beneath the surface. At one point, she reached for the bottle, and their hands brushed. A static flickered through her. Their eyes met, brief, intense, charged. Neither spoke of it. Over the next few days, Ryan texted her more frequently, casual messages, harmless on the surface. "Hope today treats you kindly. Don't let the world dim your light." Simple words, but she clung to them like lifelines. She began dressing differently, subtly at first. A little lipstick, a touch of perfume. Not for Daniel. He barely looked at her. But when Ryan came by, his eyes lingered, and that quiet admiration stirred something long dormant. One evening, Daniel announced he'd be traveling for a conference. "Just a couple of nights," he said, barely glancing up from his laptop. Emily nodded. Inside, a strange thrill curled beneath her ribs. Not because he'd be gone, but because Ryan wouldn't be. The following evening, Ryan showed up with takeout and a crooked smile. They ate in the living room, their knees brushing beneath the low table. Every shared laugh, every glance, felt heavier than it should. After dinner, she began clearing the plates, but Ryan stopped her. "Leave it," he said gently. "Sit with me a little longer." They moved to the couch. The space between them was slim, a breath, a heartbeat. "I worry about you," Ryan said after a moment. "I see the way you carry yourself, like you're folding inward just to take up less space." Emily looked at him, eyes burning. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing." "You're not," he whispered. "I see every part of you." She looked away, afraid her eyes would say too much. His hand brushed hers again, deliberate this time. No apology followed. The air thickened. He leaned in slightly, then paused. "Tell me to stop," he said softly. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her silence was permission, and they both knew it. His lips hovered close, the tension unbearable. But instead of kissing her, he pulled away, exhaling sharply. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "Ryan." He turned at the door, conflicted. "I don't want to be a mistake you regret." She couldn't speak. Her throat had tightened around the lump of confusion, desire, and guilt. When the door closed behind him, the silence roared louder than ever. She stood there for a long time, fingers touching her lips, even though they hadn't been kissed. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur of restraint. Emily moved through her routines like a ghost tethered to habit, cooking, cleaning, smiling politely when Daniel spoke, nodding when he wasn't really listening. But something inside her had shifted. Ryan's almost kiss had left an imprint, a quiet hunger, a lingering ache in places she didn't know could feel hollow. Daniel returned from his conference late one evening, suitcase in hand and phone still glued to his palm. "Flight was delayed," he muttered, brushing past her toward the stairs. "No welcome back?" she asked, half teasing, half hoping. He glanced at her, distracted. "I'm exhausted, Em. We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow. It was always tomorrow. That night, he fell asleep within minutes. She lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, her body cold inches from his. His back turned as usual, his breathing steady, distant. The next morning, he forgot her birthday. No message. No note. Not even a passing mention. By mid-afternoon, Emily stopped hoping. She didn't cry, she was long past tears. She just felt erased. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Ryan stood there, holding a bouquet of soft lavender roses and a small white box tied with a satin ribbon. "I didn't forget," he said simply. Her breath caught. "How did you? You mentioned it once months ago." I remembered. The roses were her favorite. She hadn't seen them in years. "Come in," she said quietly. They sat in the living room, sunlight pouring through the curtains, soft music playing in the background. He handed her the box. It was a delicate silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Nothing flashy, just thoughtful. Emily ran her fingers over the charm. "It's beautiful." "You're beautiful," Ryan replied, almost without thinking. She looked up, and this time, she didn't look away. They drank wine slowly, words unraveling between them like silk threads. She told him about the forgotten birthday, about the years of loneliness disguised as loyalty. Ryan listened, not just with his ears, but with his eyes, his posture, his stillness. He heard her, and then, without a script or warning, she broke. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." He reached for her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She collapsed against him, every part of her body longing to be held, not out of desire, but out of desperation. "I'm here," he whispered into her hair. "You don't have to do this alone." Their lips met, slow, uncertain, trembling. It wasn't lust that drove it. It was longing, years of emotional starvation finally erupting in a single breath. His hands cupped her face, reverent and deliberate. She responded, letting the kiss deepen, letting herself feel wanted. One kiss became two, then three, then a surrender. They moved wordlessly through the house, every step charged with the electricity of crossing a line they couldn't uncross. In her bedroom, moonlight danced on the walls. Ryan kissed her collarbone, murmuring her name like a prayer. She let her robe slip from her shoulders, vulnerability bare beneath. His fingers trailed down her spine, slow and tender. He spread her legs and put his. The sentence hung there, unfinished, unspoken. It didn't need to be said. The story was no longer about the act, but what led to it. The silence. The ache. The years of being untouched, unnoticed. Their bodies moved in rhythm, not hurried, not frantic, but like two souls trying to remember what intimacy was supposed to feel like. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other, breathless and quiet. Ryan stroked her hair. "Tell me this wasn't just loneliness." Emily didn't answer. She didn't know how. Because maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was something deeper. "I don't regret it," he said softly. She turned her head, meeting his eyes. "But I do." His face fell, but he nodded. "Then I'll carry it for both of us." They didn't speak again. He dressed quietly and kissed her forehead before leaving. Emily remained in bed, staring at the ceiling once more, but it felt different now. Not because she had found what she was missing, but because she had crossed a boundary that could never be redrawn. A boundary between longing and betrayal, between wanting and acting, between remembering and forgetting. Morning light crept into the room, soft and unforgiving. Emily lay still, her body tangled in sheets that now felt foreign. The scent of Ryan still clung to her skin, faint but undeniable. Her heartbeat echoed in the silence, heavy with consequence. Reality had returned, not with shouting or discovery, but with a cold, quiet weight that settled in her chest. She rose slowly, wrapping her robe around herself as though it could shield her from the guilt that clung to her like a second skin. Downstairs, the house looked unchanged, neat, quiet, deceptively normal. But inside her, everything had shifted. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. "I'm sorry if I overstepped last night, but I meant every word. I meant every touch." She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering, unsure whether to reply or delete it altogether. Instead, she placed the phone face down and walked to the kitchen. The roses he had brought still sat in the vase, vibrant and soft, a cruel contrast to the storm within her. By mid-morning, Daniel emerged from his office. He yawned, poured himself coffee, and gave her a brief nod. I was thinking we could go out for dinner tonight, he said casually, as if nothing had changed. As if nothing ever had. Emily blinked, startled. Dinner?
Yeah.
Somewhere nice. It's been a while. She studied him for a moment. His tone was flat, his eyes tired, but he was trying, barely, awkwardly, but trying. She wondered if he sensed something. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe it was just convenience disguised as care. Okay, she said, voice low. But as the day wore on, her thoughts returned to Ryan. To his hands, his breath, his words. To the way he had looked at her. Not with duty, but with desire. And yet, it wasn't desire alone that haunted her. It was the intimacy, the connection, the stark contrast between being touched and being seen. Later that evening, she stood before her mirror, applying lipstick she hadn't worn in years. Not for Daniel. Not for Ryan. For herself. Perhaps for the woman she had buried long ago under layers of obligation and silence. At dinner, Daniel made small talk. Work updates, investment news, a comment about remodeling the kitchen. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't notice the new dress she wore. When the waiter poured their wine, she looked across the table and saw a man she had loved, but no longer knew. She tried to listen, to engage, to convince herself that this life was still salvageable. But everything sounded hollow. Are you okay? Daniel asked suddenly, noticing her distant gaze. I'm fine, she lied. Back home. He went straight to bed. She lingered downstairs, staring out the window, phone in hand. Another message from Ryan had appeared. Just 3 words. Do you regret it? Her chest tightened. She typed, erased, typed again. Finally, she responded. I don't know. A few seconds passed. I meant it when I said you deserve more, he replied. Even if it's not me. Tears welled in her eyes, not for Ryan, and not for Daniel, but for herself. For the years she'd spent shrinking, dimming her own light to keep peace, to keep order, to keep a marriage intact while her heart quietly bled. She didn't reply again. Instead, she opened her journal, a habit she had long abandoned, and wrote for hours. Not about betrayal, not even about love, but about the ache of being invisible. The slow erosion of self that comes not from one single act, but from years of being unseen. By morning, the house stirred again. Daniel kissed her forehead out of routine, not affection. He left for work, unaware that she had already packed a small bag tucked beneath the bed. She hadn't made a decision yet. Not entirely. But she knew one thing with clarity. Something had to change. Whether she walked toward freedom or back into silence would depend on what she chose next, not just for love, but for herself. As she closed her journal, one final line echoed on the last page. Sometimes, the greatest betrayal is forgetting your own worth. And for the first time in years, Emily remembered.